August 1944, Central Texas. The air ripples with heat, thick with the smell of dust and sweat-soaked leather. The fairgrounds shimmer beyond a barbed wire fence, where a battered loudspeaker crackles to life. Then a gunshot pop. A gate bursts open. Hooves thunder. Dust erupts in golden clouds as a rider clings to a bucking bronco. Across the dirt road, behind their wire boundary, a line of German prisoners freezes. Their striped work shirts darkened with sweat, shovels half raised. One drops his tool. Another ducks, instinctively scanning the ridgeline. The guards turn, rifles slung, startled by the same sound, but then they smile. The loudspeaker booms again. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Texas County Rodeo." A cheer rises from the crowd, but the POWs don't cheer. They watch in tense silence, mistaking the arena's chaos for a combat drill. To them, the rhythm of horses, whips, and marching drums looks like pre-battle training. They had survived North Africa's deserts, crossed the Atlantic in chains, and now, on this blazing Texas afternoon, they believed war had found them again. By the summer of 1944, the war in Europe had turned decisively against Germany. In North Africa, Rommel's Afrika Korps had collapsed, and entire divisions of the Wehrmacht were captured by advancing Allied forces. The United States suddenly found itself in possession of tens of thousands of Axis prisoners, men who had once fought fiercely under the desert sun and now stood unarmed, exhausted, and uncertain of their fate. Transporting them back to war-torn Europe was impractical. The Atlantic was already teeming with U-boats and convoys, and the Allied High Command needed its ships for fuel, food, and ammunition. So the War Department made an unusual decision. The prisoners would be brought to America itself. By 1943, trainloads of captured Germans were arriving at ports like Norfolk and New Orleans, then scattered inland under heavy guard. The logic was simple. Distance meant security. A man held thousands of miles from the Reich could neither escape easily nor influence battlefields he'd left behind. And nowhere was that distance greater, or the landscape more alien to a European soldier, than Texas. The state's size, rail networks, and climate made it ideal for housing POWs. From Camp Hearn to Camp Huntsville, from Hereford in the Panhandle to Camp Swift near Austin, more than 70 base and branch camps soon dotted the Lone Star Plains. Each was built on the same model: barbed wire perimeters, watchtowers, barracks of rough timber, and central compounds large enough for thousands of men. Most of the prisoners had been captured in North Africa, veterans of El Alamein, Tunisia, and Sicily. Many had expected icy prison blocks or forced labor. Instead, they found something both orderly and bewildering: barracks with clean cots, steady meals, and libraries stocked with donated American books. The Geneva Convention of 1929 guaranteed them certain rights, and the U.S. military, eager to set a moral example, generally followed those rules to the letter. Prisoners received pay credits for their work, could send letters home after censorship, and even formed orchestras, soccer teams, and art clubs inside the camps. Yet behind the routine lay tension. Within the ranks, hardline Nazis tried to enforce ideological discipline, punishing or even murdering comrades they deemed traitors. American guards learned to watch not only for escape attempts, but for violence between prisoners themselves. Outside the wire, Texans watched with curiosity. Most had never seen a German up close. Newspapers had painted the enemy as fanatical and cruel, but the men behind the fences looked young, tanned, and weary, hardly monsters. Many locals would drive past the camps just to glimpse them, trading rumors. They eat better than we do. They speak perfect English. They built that whole fence themselves. Before long, the army found a practical use for its new workforce. With so many American men overseas, farms and factories faced crippling labor shortages. Under supervised programs, POWs were sent out daily to harvest cotton, cut timber, and pick fruit. They earned a few cents in camp scrip, while farmers paid the government by the hour. The arrangement suited everyone. Crops were saved, guards kept order, and the prisoners were grateful for time outside the wire. A typical workday began before sunrise. Military trucks rolled through the gates, loaded with Germans under guard. They rode in silence past ranches, fields, and Baptist churches, the wind whipping their khaki caps. At noon, the trucks often stopped at roadside shade or small-town fairgrounds for rest and rations. To these men, trained soldiers far from home, every unfamiliar sound carried tension. The crack of a whip, a burst of music, the pop of fireworks, all could mean danger. Texas itself seemed like a paradox. It was a land untouched by bombing raids, where grocery shelves were full and families picnicked under the same sun that burned in Tunisia. For men raised on Goebbels' vision of a starving, divided America, this abundance was disorienting, and it was here, amid cotton fields and cattle pens, that one of the war's strangest misunderstandings would unfold, because in late 1944, in a small Texas town whose name barely made the papers, a group of German POWs were sent on a work detail near the county fairgrounds. They expected routine field labor and a quiet afternoon. Instead, they heard the roar of a crowd, the crack of a starting gun, and the rush of hooves pounding the dust. They believed, for one brief and bewildering hour, that America was training for the next invasion. The American home front of 1944 pulsed with paradoxes. While young men fought and died across oceans, life inside the United States continued in a rhythm that mixed sacrifice with celebration. Factories ran day and night, ration coupons filled kitchen drawers, and every scrap of tin or rubber was collected for the war effort. Yet across rural America, the traditions that defined local life refused to fade, none more so than the rodeo. In Texas, rodeo wasn't just entertainment. It was identity. What began as ranch hand competitions had, by the 1940s, become full-scale community rituals, complete with flags, marching bands, barbecue stands, and brass trophies. Town squares erupted in parades. Cowboys showed off horsemanship as patriotic spectacle. Posters proclaimed, "Buy war bonds at the rodeo." Veterans were honored. Children rode in mock cavalry parades, and the announcer's voice, booming through wooden loudspeakers, filled the summer air. To Texans, it was home. To German prisoners, it was chaos. The men who watched from behind fences or from the backs of guarded trucks had never seen anything like it. In Germany, the only large outdoor gatherings of recent memory had been military parades or party rallies. Precision, order, the clatter of boots on cobblestone. Here the rhythm was wild, improvised, joyful. Yet the visual vocabulary, flags, formations, uniformed riders, felt unsettlingly familiar. For a German trained to read terrain and movement, the rodeo's choreography looked like a field exercise. Horses charging from chutes resembled cavalry drills. Dust plumes recalled tank maneuvers. Even the banners snapping in the wind looked like regimental colors. Some prisoners whispered that the Americans were preparing mounted troops for invasion training. Others thought they were watching a militia drill disguised as sport, and the sounds, that's what shook them most. Loudspeakers blared commands that to a non-English ear sounded clipped and martial. The announcer's voice barked through distortion. "Gate 3, stand by! Release!" The gate clanged. The crowd roared. To the POWs, the rhythm was unmistakable. The cadence of battle. Accounts from several camps record such confusion. At Camp Herne, one German later recalled hearing gunfire from the fairground and diving instinctively to the ground before realizing it was fireworks. At Camp Huntsville, guards laughed as new arrivals mistook rodeo cheers for air raid sirens. The misunderstandings were harmless but revealing. They exposed just how foreign America seemed to these men. Inside Germany, propaganda had painted the United States as decadent and weak, a land of unemployment and racial turmoil, a nation collapsing under greed. The war had been sold as a crusade to destroy that corruption. Yet here were farmers and ranchers who could afford laughter, leisure, and livestock contests while fighting a global war. To the Germans, this abundance bordered on the surreal. The country that had captured them did not appear exhausted by conflict. It seemed energized by it, The realization gnawed at their assumptions. How could an enemy this confident, this well-fed, possibly be losing anywhere? For the Americans, the prisoners' reactions were a curiosity. Guards often watched the men's puzzled expressions as they passed a fairground or parade. Occasionally, local commanders allowed small work details to observe from a distance, believing it harmless, even educational. The guards understood that morale mattered. Showing the prisoners a thriving civilian life could do more to undermine Nazi indoctrination than lectures ever would. And indeed, it did. In interviews conducted years later, former POWs described their shock at seeing freedom in motion. They spoke of girls in summer dresses, families cheering, and men in uniform smiling instead of shouting. "It was the first time I saw Americans not as soldiers," one said, "but as people enjoying peace during war." The Texas Rodeo, then, was more than spectacle. It was a mirror. For Germans raised in a regimented state, it reflected a society confident enough to laugh in wartime. The prisoners didn't yet know it. But that brief moment of confusion, that strange thunder of hooves mistaken for gunfire, would become a turning point. It would mark the first crack in the wall of propaganda that separated captor from captive. Next came the human reactions, the guards' interpretations, and the chain of small realizations that followed, each an angle on one unforgettable misunderstanding. The human angle. Soldiers without a war for the German prisoners. Life in Texas blurred the line between survival and surrender. They had once been soldiers, professionals who had lived by the logic of discipline, danger, and duty. Now in the American South, they were laborers in borrowed clothes, surrounded by a world that neither feared nor revered them. To cope, many clung to the instincts that had once kept them alive. When the thunder of hooves reached their ears at the rodeo grounds, those instincts roared back. The mind of a soldier does not forget training. A sudden noise meant artillery. A crowd's roar could mask an attack. The sight of formations, even of riders circling an arena, activated muscle memory shaped by years of marching and fighting. For a few seconds, they were no longer prisoners, but combat men reacting to threat. And then came the confusion. No gunfire followed, no orders barked. Only applause, laughter, music. The same hands that once clutched rifles now shielded eyes from sunlight as they squinted toward bleachers full of families. In that dissonance between war and peace, fear and fascination, the prisoners faced something deeper than culture shock. They confronted the idea that a nation could fight with total might abroad while living freely at home. For men raised under totalitarian regimentation, the sight was almost incomprehensible. The tactical guard angle, control and caution for the American guards. The incident was almost comical, but it was also a reminder of their delicate balancing act. Texas camps operated under strict Army regulations, yet much of daily discipline relied on human judgment. Guards were often young National Guard reservists, older veterans, or even wounded soldiers unfit for frontline service. Their job was less about combat readiness and more about steady nerves and empathy. When a rodeo or parade erupted nearby, officers anticipated confusion. The guards' first duty was to maintain order, weapons slung, eyes on the fence, no sudden moves that might escalate panic. They knew that even the faintest misunderstanding could spiral. A startled POW could bolt. A nervous guard could overreact. For that reason, distance was always maintained. Trucks carrying prisoners parked at a safe remove from the arena. Details rested under shade, never among the crowd. Reports from multiple camps note similar precautions. When loud events occurred within earshot, guards would explain the noise. That's just a fair, not a drill. But language barriers often blunted those reassurances. The Germans might hear fireworks and picture gunfire. The guards, hearing laughter, relaxed. It was a small theater of perception, two sides of the same field, hearing the same sounds, assigning them opposite meanings. And beneath it all, there was a kind of respect. Many guards admitted admiration for the prisoners' discipline. They followed commands sharply, lined up with precision, and worked long hours without complaint. Yet those same qualities, the trained reflexes of soldiers, made moments like the Rodeo misunderstanding inevitable. These men had spent years decoding danger. Unlearning that was harder than capture itself. The cultural linguistic angle, when words sound like war language, compounded everything. Few of the early POWs spoke English fluently, and those who did often acted as interpreters for their work teams. But sound travels faster than understanding. The rodeo announcer's drawl, stretched and distorted through tin loudspeakers, turned ordinary phrases into near-military code. Gate 3, stand by, sounded like a command. Release, echoed like an order to fire. Even the word bullpen resembled a German term for holding ground. The rhythm of American showmanship, fast, emphatic, rhythmic, was alien to ears, tuned to the clipped consonants of parade grounds. To the prisoners, those tones triggered reflex and suspicion. The Germans were trained to analyze acoustic cues. Aircraft approach, shell whistle, the clatter of tracked vehicles. A fairground loudspeaker fit neatly into that lexicon of threat. The mind, once conditioned by war, often bends the unfamiliar into the familiar. Only after repeated exposure did patterns shift. Days later, when the same men heard country music through static or the crack of fireworks from a nearby festival, they hesitated, but did not flinch. Understanding had begun to replace instinct. In this way, language, or rather sound, became the first bridge between captor and captive. It turned confusion into curiosity. The Germans began asking questions. What is this Rodeo? And the guards, sometimes amused, sometimes patient, tried to explain. The lesson was subtle but profound. Words could separate men as surely as fences. But they could also break those fences down. Each of these angles revealed a fragment of the same truth, that perception in war is not fixed, but shaped by memory and fear. The next set of angles would probe deeper into technology, leadership, psychology, and the very image each side held of the other. The technological angle, machines of leisure. Mistaken for war to the eyes of a trained soldier, technology is never neutral. Every machine hums with purpose. Trucks move supplies, lights reveal targets, loudspeakers carry orders. When German POWs glimpsed the Texas rodeo grounds, their instinctive readings of technology betrayed the world they came from. They saw trucks pulling stock trailers and mistook them for troop transports. Floodlights, set to illuminate the arena at dusk, reminded them of searchlights used to spot Allied bombers. The metallic clang of chutes and gates echoed the field noises of mobile artillery. Even the horns, blaring from fairground vehicles, resembled the alarm sirens of desert convoys. To an American family, these were tools of entertainment. To a man who had fought in Tunisia or Sicily, they were symbols of imminent battle. That confusion exposed a psychological divide between two modernities, one shaped by total war, the other by industrial abundance. The United States could repurpose technology for joy because it possessed enough to spare. Germany, strained and starving, could only view machinery through the lens of survival. Some guards noted the prisoners' fascination with American trucks and generators. A few asked to study their engines, unable to believe that vehicles so plentiful could be used for ranch work instead of war. For men who had marched through ruins, Texas represented something impossible, a civilization untouched by scarcity. The rodeo's floodlights were not weapons. They were proof that America could illuminate its nights without fear. That realization, more than the spectacle itself, began to shift minds. Technology, once an instrument of destruction, had become an emblem of confidence. 5. The leadership psychological angle. Commanders on both sides within the camps, leadership functioned on two levels, official and informal. On paper, U.S. Army officers commanded the compounds. Within the wire, German non-commissioned officers and senior sergeants maintained internal discipline. The Geneva Convention allowed it, and American policy encouraged order so long as it didn't threaten control. When the rodeo confusion unfolded, both chains of command reacted instantly, but differently. The American lieutenant in charge ordered calm, reminding guards not to raise weapons or shout. His German counterpart, an aging Feldwebel captured in North Africa, barked instructions in his native tongue, snapping the prisoners back into line. Neither wanted escalation. Both understood how thin the line was between order and panic. Later that evening, camp officers discussed the episode over mess coffee. Some laughed. Others recognized its deeper meaning. The German sergeants, meanwhile, used it to teach discipline. You see, the Americans drill even during celebrations. Ironically, their attempt to save face reinforced the same misunderstanding. Psychologically, it exposed the fragility of belief systems built on propaganda. To admit that Americans could celebrate freely during wartime was to admit that their system worked. For German leaders, whose authority rested on ideological certainty, that realization was dangerous. Slowly, the tension between old obedience and new evidence began to erode control inside the camps. American officers, many trained in psychology, sensed this shift. They understood that cultural exposure, fairs, music, churches, even small-town kindness, did more to reshape prisoners' minds than any leaflet. They called it re-education through observation, and without ever planning it, the Texas rodeo had become one of its most effective lessons. The enemy image angle, seeing the other for the first time, to the Americans in the bleachers. The Germans were shadows beyond the fence, quiet, polite, sometimes waving if waved to. To the Germans, the Texans were an enigma, people who could ride bulls, drink cola, and sing under wartime banners while the rest of the world burned. In that first rodeo, many prisoners expected hostility. They anticipated jeers, insults, perhaps stones thrown their way. Instead, they saw families waving casually, children pointing curiously, some even tossing them apples or bottles of soda over the wire, gestures that confounded everything they had been told about the enemy. The impact of those small moments cannot be overstated. Years later, memoirs from former POWs recalled the shock of kindness more vividly than the fear of capture. One wrote, "We had been told Americans were savages, but the only weapons we saw were smiles." The rodeo stood as a living contradiction to Nazi ideology. It portrayed strength without cruelty, confidence without arrogance. The sight of cowboys risking broken bones for sport, cheered on by families, encapsulated a spirit that Germans found both reckless and admirable. Over time, this perception softened the invisible wall between the two sides. Prisoners began to help with local harvests more willingly. Guards grew less wary and small exchanges of trust emerged. Coffee shared, a joke attempted in broken English, a handshake after a day's work. It began with misunderstanding. It ended with recognition. Each of these angles, from technology to empathy, converged on a single realization: that the confusion at the rodeo was not merely comic, but symbolic. It revealed two worlds colliding, one that viewed motion as threat, and another that saw it as freedom. The next chapter would bring that symbolism to its peak, the moment when the misunderstanding unfolded in full, transforming from fear to laughter. The sun was still high when the first bronc exploded from the chute. A dry wind whipped dust across the field, carrying the smell of hay, sweat, and gunpowder from the starters' blanks. On the far side of the fairground, a convoy of olive-drab trucks rolled to a stop, engines idling. Inside the last one sat 20 German prisoners of war, their shirts open at the collar, wrists resting loosely on their knees, each under the watch of 2 armed guards. They had spent the morning cutting brush for fence posts outside town. It was routine work, backbreaking, monotonous, predictable. But now, through the rattling truck slats, they could see movement in the distance: horses, flags, smoke, and what looked like soldiers in formation. Then came the sound, the hard metallic snap of the chute gate, the roar of a crowd, the thunder of hooves. The Germans stiffened instantly. One man cursed under his breath, another instinctively reached for a rifle that wasn't there. Achtung! Someone hissed. Drill! Maybe training. The guards exchanged puzzled glances. Then they saw it. The grandstand, the bunting, the bright letters on a banner flapping in the wind. Texas County War Bond Rodeo. The lieutenant in charge, a lean, tanned man from Amarillo, stepped off the lead truck and laughed quietly. Relax, fellas, he said to his men. Ain't no invasion startin' here. He ordered the trucks to halt in the shade near the fence line. The prisoners, still tense, were told to dismount and rest while the rodeo played on a few hundred yards away. From their vantage point, the Germans could see almost everything. Cowboys in pressed shirts and wide hats, flags waving, an announcer shouting through a megaphone. It looked to them like organized chaos. Men charged on horseback with ropes. Others wrestled steers to the ground. Women in bright skirts cheered and waved handkerchiefs. It was spectacle, loud, fearless, and utterly foreign. Then came the event that sealed their confusion. A team of riders entered in formation, carrying American flags. The band struck up the Star-Spangled Banner. The riders turned sharply, their horses kicking dust into the sky. To the prisoners, trained to read precision riding as military discipline, it looked unmistakably like a cavalry unit. One man muttered, "They're practicing for invasion." Mounted troops, American style. A guard overheard and smiled. "No, sir," he said kindly in broken German. "Nicht Krieg, rodeo," but the word meant nothing to most. They watched in disbelief as one rider, spurred and shouting, launched himself onto a raging bull, holding with one hand as the crowd erupted. The energy of it, reckless, defiant, absurd, seemed impossible. Who would risk death for applause? In Germany, risk was duty. Here, it was entertainment. For a few tense minutes, misunderstanding turned to awe. Even the guards fell silent, their boots buried in dust, watching a cowboy tossed high, then landing hard and rising to wave. The crowd's roar swelled, and suddenly, as the announcer shouted something about 8 seconds, one of the Germans began to laugh. Not mockingly, but in relief. He turned to his comrades, shaking his head. "Kein maneuver," he said. "No exercise. Just madness." The laughter spread quietly through the ranks. Shoulders eased, postures softened. They realized the truth all at once. This wasn't training. It was celebration. A strange, thunderous kind of freedom. On the far side of the arena, a cowboy tipped his hat toward the fence, perhaps unaware that a line of enemy soldiers watched him as if witnessing another world. One of the prisoners, a young man named Carl, later recalled that moment. The American rodeo was more dangerous than battle, but the men smiled. For guards and captives alike, the tension of that hour melted into something close to wonder. The Germans began to cheer softly, clapping when a rider stayed mounted. A guard shouted jokingly, "That's right, Fritz, cheer him on." The crowd beyond the fence never knew how close they had come to being mistaken for an army drill. When the trucks rolled back to camp that evening, the prisoners were still talking. Some argued that America was wasting strength on games. Others saw something deeper, a confidence no dictatorship could imitate. They had seen soldiers who didn't march, civilians who weren't afraid, and a country that could turn danger into sport. As the convoy rattled down the dirt road, the lieutenant glanced back through the dust at the receding fairground lights. "Guess they got their first real taste of Texas today," he said quietly. He was right, but what they had truly tasted was the contradiction of America, a nation at total war, yet free enough to laugh at the noise of battle. That evening, the air inside the camp was alive with talk. The German prisoners sat in clusters outside their barracks, smoking, gesturing, arguing softly under the hum of the floodlights. The confusion of the day still lingered in their minds, the sound of hooves, the applause, the reckless spectacle. To men who had lived through Kasserine and Tobruk, the rodeo felt unreal, like a hallucination stitched together from familiar sounds but impossible meanings. Some prisoners refused to believe it had been just sport. It was training, one insisted. Why else would soldiers ride like that? Why fire blanks and shout commands? His comrade, a farmer from Bavaria, shook his head. No army would waste men like that, he said quietly. They were laughing. Inside the guardhouse, American soldiers shared their own amusement. One corporal, barely 20, described the scene to his captain. They thought we were mobilizing horses for invasion. One even ducked like he was under artillery. The captain chuckled, then turned serious. Don't mock them too much, he said. Those fellas been hearing gunfire for years. Hard to tell a cheer from an attack after that. That comment hung in the air like wisdom. The rodeo wasn't just an afternoon diversion. It had become an X-ray of the war's psychology. It revealed what constant fear did to the human ear, how easily a celebration could sound like a command, and how quickly joy could be mistaken for danger. As days passed, the memory of that misunderstanding spread through the camp like rumor and legend. New arrivals heard the story and laughed nervously. Some used it to tease others. Don't flinch next time the Texans ride bulls. But beneath the laughter ran an undercurrent of respect. These Americans, they realized, lived without the dread that had defined life in Germany. Their parades were not propaganda. Their flags did not march men to their deaths. In small ways, the change showed. Prisoners who once saluted their sergeants with rigid precision now nodded casually. The hardline Nazis within the compound, men who still clung to slogans and salutes, found fewer listeners. Letters home, though censored, began to carry subtle shifts in tone. The Americans are strange, one wrote. They fight, but they also play. The camp chaplain, a Methodist minister from Houston, noticed it too. Attendance at his optional English classes grew. The Germans, once skeptical, now seemed curious about American words. Freedom, work, family, God. One prisoner told him, I want to know what kind of people have rodeos during war. The guards, for their part, felt the tension ease. Jokes replaced suspicion. A private who had once stared down the fence now shared cigarettes with his charges on breaks. You boys sure thought we were cavalry, he teased. No, no, one replied with a grin. You are better riders than soldiers. The remark drew laughter on both sides, the first shared laughter since capture. Beyond the wire, the local community began to hear about the incident. The town's weekly paper ran a light-hearted column. POWs mistake rodeo for war drill. It described how our visitors from Germany learned that Texans prefer fighting bulls to battles. The headline drew smiles, but beneath the humor lay quiet pride. Texans had always seen the rodeo as proof of toughness and freedom. Now it had accidentally served as a lesson in democracy. In the weeks that followed, similar scenes repeated elsewhere. At Camp Hearn, prisoners paused work to watch Independence Day fireworks, bracing for shellfire before realizing it was celebration. At Camp Swift, a marching band's rehearsal triggered momentary panic until laughter took its place. Each event chipped away at the invisible wall separating conqueror and conquered. One guard later reflected, we never planned to teach them anything, but they saw for themselves that we weren't afraid of the dark. By autumn, the transformation was visible. Prisoners volunteered more readily for work details. The guards relaxed protocol without losing discipline. There were fewer fights inside the wire, fewer escape attempts. The rodeo had become part of camp folklore, a story retold so often it lost its sting of fear and gained the warmth of memory. Years later, when those men returned to Germany, the story survived in memoirs and conversations. In small towns from Bremen to Munich, former POWs described a day in Texas when they thought the war had followed them, and instead found laughter. Many of them spoke of that moment as the first time they doubted the Nazi vision of the enemy, because in the dust of a Texas rodeo, they had witnessed something Hitler's propaganda could never explain. Strength without brutality, courage without command, and joy in the very face of war. The misunderstanding that began in fear had ended as revelation, and in that unlikely place, under the blinding Texas sun, between flags and fences, both sides glimpsed what peace might actually look like. When the trucks rolled back through the gates that evening, the Texas sun was already dropping into a bronze haze. The guards logged the prisoners' return. No incidents, no escapes, and the compound fell quiet except for the distant hum of cicadas. Yet inside those fences, something had changed. The men who filed into the barracks carried an image they couldn't shake. Horses leaping through dust, music blaring, a crowd roaring without fear. In the following days, camp officers noted a subtle shift in behavior. The Germans, once rigid, suspicious and inward, grew more talkative. Their work in the fields moved faster. Guards overheard them comparing American tools to German ones, joking about cowboy bravery, even mimicking rodeo calls with laughter. The fear that had clenched their movements for months seemed to ease. Psychologists attached to the prisoner of war. Administration later observed this phenomenon elsewhere, moments of cultural exposure that softened resistance. It wasn't propaganda in the traditional sense. No leaflets, no lectures, just contact. Seeing Americans live without dread accomplished what words never could. In Washington, the office of the Provost Marshal General quietly studied these effects. The United States had no formal program of re-education yet, but officers began compiling field reports describing how humane treatment and exposure to civilian life undermined Nazi indoctrination. The Texas Rodeo incident, as one memo labeled it, became a small but telling case study. Enemy prisoners encountering American civilian recreation interpreted activity as military preparation. Reaction: confusion followed by curiosity and mild admiration. Inside Camp Hearn, similar reflections appeared in prisoners' own writings. The camp newspaper, Der Spiegel, published under U.S. oversight, printed a short essay titled "When the Dust Rose Over Texas." Its author, a former Wehrmacht sergeant, described his realization that Americans laugh where we would salute. The piece circulated through barracks and was quietly tolerated by guards, a sign of shifting morale. For the Americans, the lesson was equally valuable. The rodeo misunderstanding reminded them that even disciplined enemies were still human beings, men shaped by fear, culture, and memory. Guards who had once seen the Germans as faceless adversaries began to recognize them as individuals. Hans, the carpenter; Dieter, the mechanic; Otto, the teacher from Hamburg. When a guard nicknamed Slim broke his wrist one day unloading supplies, a German medic volunteered to set it, gently, expertly. "I did this on the Eastern Front," he said softly. The bones are the same. Outside the wire, townsfolk who'd once been wary began softening too. Farmers invited supervised work crews into their fields. Bakers handed out scraps of pie. Children waved at trucks as they passed. In the middle of total war, ordinary Americans discovered that kindness was a form of victory. Still, the army remained cautious. The command reminded guards that the prisoners were soldiers of the enemy state until peace was declared. Security stayed strict. No fraternization beyond duty, no personal exchanges, no gifts. Yet even with rules intact, the mood inside Texas camps continued to thaw. At evening roll calls, a quiet contentment replaced earlier defiance. Men still stood straight, but their gazes drifted beyond the wire, toward sunsets, sounds of laughter, and faint strains of music from the nearby towns. They had seen a country unscarred by bombs, unbroken by defeat, alive with paradoxical joy. In letters home, many tried to capture that feeling within the limits of censorship. "The land is wide," one wrote, "and people are free to shout for sport." Another said simply, "It is not as we were told." The transformation was slow but irreversible. What had begun as fear had become fascination. The rodeo that once seemed like a battle drill had opened a small window into another way of living. One that could not be ordered, only witnessed. By the end of 1945, the barbed wire around Texas was no longer the edge of fear, it was the border of memory. Germany had surrendered. The war was over, and across the American South and Midwest, hundreds of prisoner-of-war camps began to empty. Train after train carried men eastward, to ports, to ships, to a homeland most no longer recognized. For many of those who left Texas, the farewell was unexpectedly emotional. Guards who had once watched them with suspicion now shook their hands. Farmers drove to the rail sidings to wave goodbye to the men who had harvested their crops. Some families sent small parcels, a handkerchief, a Bible, a photograph. One Texas woman slipped a note into a departing prisoner's palm. It read simply, "You saw us at peace. May you find your own." The prisoners carried more than rations and fatigue on their voyage home. They carried a changed perception of the enemy. Letters and diaries written after repatriation revealed the quiet influence of their American captivity. "We had expected cruelty," wrote a former soldier from the 10th Panzer Division. "Instead, we found order, discipline, and laughter." Another recalled the Rodeo incident directly. "When we mistook a festival for a drill, I realized that freedom makes its own kind of noise." Historians would later view the Texas camps as a unique social experiment, one that demonstrated the psychological power of humane treatment. By 1946, the U.S. War Department estimated that more than 375,000 Axis prisoners had been held in the United States, nearly 50,000 of them in Texas alone. Reports concluded that the exposure to democratic civilian life produced more enduring effects than any organized propaganda. Decades later, some of those men returned, not as prisoners, but as immigrants. A few settled quietly in Texas towns near the very fields they had once labored in. They opened bakeries, machine shops, and cafes. Locals remembered them not as enemies, but as neighbors who spoke with a careful accent and smiled when the rodeo came to town. In 1982, a small reunion was held near the former Camp Hearn site. Among the attendees were aging Texans who had been guards and a handful of German veterans who had once been behind the wire. One of them, now a grandfather, spoke through a translator. "When I first saw the rodeo," he said, "I thought you were training for war, but you were training for life." The crowd applauded quietly. No flags, no uniforms, just people remembering dust and sunlight. Time turned that misunderstanding into a parable, retold in classrooms, local museums, and veterans' halls. The old fairgrounds where the confusion began were rebuilt and used for county fairs again. Children ran where armed sentries once stood, their laughter echoing the same fearless sound that had bewildered soldiers long ago. In the archives of the Texas Historical Commission, one faded document still bears the signature of a camp commander. His final remark reads, "The prisoners responded best not to discipline, but to decency." That was the lasting lesson of the Texas rodeo, that strength could coexist with kindness, and that even in war, humanity could cross a fence more easily than politics. By the time the last POW ship left American waters, the men aboard had seen both sides of power, the destructive force of a regime and the quiet confidence of a democracy. They returned to a broken nation, carrying an unexpected souvenir, the memory of a people who fought fiercely abroad, yet lived freely at home. For years afterward, when veterans of those Texas camps met, they spoke not of battles or victories, but of that strange afternoon when they mistook laughter for gunfire, and each time they told it, the moral was the same. Freedom sounds louder than fear. The fairground is quiet now. The wind still drags dust across the old arena, and the wooden posts stand silvered with age. There are no bleachers, no crowds, no guards, just the open Texas sky, stretching endlessly. The same sky those prisoners once looked up at in disbelief. What happened that day was small in the scale of war, a few frightened men mistaking laughter for danger. Yet in that misunderstanding lay a truth far larger than any battle map. It revealed what happens when two worlds collide, one shaped by obedience and fear, the other by confidence and freedom. The German soldiers had been taught that power meant control, that discipline was strength. But in Texas, they saw a different equation, strength expressed through play, courage born from joy, and unity without command. The rodeo wasn't just sport. It was democracy in motion. Every rider who fell and rose again embodied a freedom the prisoners had never known, the freedom to fail without punishment, to cheer without orders, to live without fear. For America, it was an unconscious victory, not of arms but of example. For the Germans, it was a seed of doubt planted deep, one that would sprout years later in a rebuilding nation searching for its moral compass. History often measures war in divisions and tonnage, in treaties and lines on a map. But sometimes, its most enduring transformations begin in quieter places. A dusty field, a burst of applause, the laughter that follows fear. On that hot afternoon in 1944, behind the barbed wire of a Texas POW camp, a few weary men learned that freedom does not march in formation. It rides wild, unbroken under an open sky, and for the rest of their lives, when they remembered the sound of hooves and the roar of a crowd, they knew it hadn't been a rehearsal for war, it had been the sound of peace. History is full of moments like this, small misunderstandings that revealed something far greater. If you'd like to explore more forgotten stories of war, humanity, and truth, subscribe now and keep the past alive, one story at a time.